Good afternoon on the East Coast, good morning on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you who are joining us in Europe and Russia and across Eurasia. Thank you for joining the Atlantic Council today. I'm Damon Wilson, the Executive Vice President here at the Council, and we're delighted to be having all of you with us to talk about our event today, Russia's New Tsar, the aftermath of Putin's constitutional referendum. And I couldn't be more delighted than to be joined today by three outstanding voices to address this critical moment. Vladimir Kara-Murza, former US Ambassador, Ambassador Mike McFaul, and Lilia Shevtsova. These three remarkable individuals are remarkable thinkers, incredible actors, and some of the most important strategists on the issues facing Russia's future. It's with utmost respect that we welcome them here to the conversation today. We're so proud to count them among our friends that have so much respect for their courage and the principles in which they bring their positions to this heated debate. Russian President Vladimir Putin has, of course, been a fixture of global politics for 2 decades now. And after the symbolic July 1st vote on constitutional changes, many expect him to remain a fixture throughout this decade and into the next until 2036, perhaps. But is that the only possible outcome, or even the most likely? Russia's at a critical juncture. It's one of the hardest hit countries by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's embroiled in multiple foreign conflicts, and the Russian people have increasingly found ways to voice their displeasure. So what does the future hold for Russia? What will we find in the aftermath of this latest shakeup? How can we imagine a future democratic Russia, perhaps even? So I'm thankful that we've got this remarkable group. We're going to turn to hear from them. Vladimir Kara-Murza serves as chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. Thank you for being with us today. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Mike McFaul now serves as director of Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and was the top policymaker on this in the Obama administration. And Lilia Shevtsova joins us from Moscow, Moscow's Liberal Mission Foundation. Lilia, it's such a pleasure to welcome you back to the Atlantic Council. I hope all of you enjoyed today's discussion. I'm going to turn you over to Ambassador John Herbst to manage the conversation for today. Over to you, John.
Damon, thank you. I run the Eurasia Central Atlantic Council, and we'll start right in. And Lilia, I'll ask you the first question. Well, what is Putin up to with his constitutional reforms, and how does that fit into his overall politics?
John, Damon, thank you, first of all, for starters. It's such a great opportunity to be part of this panel. And John, I have to admit that I'm always afraid to be blinded by the moment and make insignificant significant. But this time I would agree with Damon. Russia is at the critical juncture. I will even say that the constitutional changes and the vote last week, they were a watershed in Russia's post-Putin period. Why? Not because Putin gets the right to extend his rule through 2036, rule forever. Because Putin could have done it without any kind of vote, without any kind of zoo with falsification, and even without constitutional amendments. But this is watershed moment for Russia because the changes of constitution, the overhaul of the constitution, and vote together with all other events during this year 2020 gambit, have been a kind of final touch, the final act in Putin's building of his own castle, of his own Putin's state system. And it has been Putin's personal project and his legacy, and the construction is ready already. I am personally living within this construction. And the system has new normative and political dimensions. The Kremlin offers Russia a new ideology, codifies values borrowed from the Soviet and pre-Soviet past. And most important is that personal rule is not constrained anymore by anything. So we have constitutionally defined omnipotence. Everything else is grinded into dust. Putin is closing Yeltsin's era. Putin is closing Russia's modernization efforts. And what is interesting, curious for me, is the fact that he does not necessarily wants to extend his rule forever. He wants to prepare the system to transfer to another generation of their families, their kids, etc. And he wants to create the fear that the dismantling his legacy of his own rule will unravel the state. And at the same time, as always in Russia, drama, 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 even Shakespearean drama, possibly, for Putin and for Russia itself. Because Putin, with his vote, with his, rewriting the history in order to control the past, he in fact creates existential challenges for himself, for Russia, for the ruling group. What kind of challenges? Firstly, the vote last week demonstrated that Putin possibly has created himself grumpy, angry, maybe majority, at least electorate, that consists not only of critical liberals, but of nationalists, left-wingers, etc. And secondly, Putin has failed to resolve the conflict, which will be inherent, genetic to this kind of system, the conflict between the omnipotence regime that is longing for certainty and for eternity, and on the other hand, legitimacy. And Mike will tell us that this is the only mechanism and instrument to legitimize this kind of a system. So no certainty, because elections bring no certainty. So in the end, it looks like Putin has failed to stabilize the system, to create certainty, to create stability, and instead he has been practicing what? Suicidal statecraft. The more he stays, the more brittle the system becomes. Even more for us important is the fact that this kind of system with constitutional rigidity perhaps will be much more difficult to transform pain without any kind of pain. And I'm looking at Mike, and I believe that Mike will find a good definition for this kind of Putin's castle surrounded by walls and insulated from the world.
Lilia, thank you. I'm a big fan of alliteration. Suicidal statecraft is a wonderful phrase. Okay, Vladimir, there were reports of ballot stuffing, employers coercing their employees to vote. Exit polls by the opposition organization Niet said that despite official tallies, a majority in St. Petersburg and Moscow voted against the plebiscite. Even the EU has questioned the results. Do you think Putin has achieved his objectives with the vote?
Ambassador Herbst, thank you so much for having us and to the Atlantic Council for hosting this meeting, and I look forward to the day we'll all be able to finally meet in real life, in person, in the same room. When you introduced this event, you mentioned the word referendum, and I think it's important to correct the terminology here straight away. This was not a referendum. A referendum is something that is codified in Russian law. A referendum is something that's also governed by the international framework as part of our country's membership in organizations such as the Council of Europe or the OSCE. And a referendum would come with a certain set of rules. For example, the opportunity to campaign on both sides, on a yes and a no. It would come with a certain established set of criteria and procedures for voting and the vote counting. It would come, importantly, with the opportunity for international and domestic independent observation. And I can continue this list for a long time. None of this happened last week. In fact, the Russian authorities themselves did not call this exercise a referendum. They called it, and this is what Vladimir Putin has termed it himself, a plebiscite. And here I can say as a historian, wording is really important. A plebiscite is a term that was favored by European dictatorships, mostly fascist dictatorships of the early part of the 20th century. Franco had plebiscites, Hitler had plebiscites, Mussolini had plebiscites. And so this extra-legal and ill-defined plebiscite that happened in Russia had officially no campaign whatsoever, which in practice, of course, meant that the entire government apparatus was mobilized to produce a yes vote in the form of, as you mentioned, coercion of public employees all over the country. There were dozens of reports from all over Russia that public sector employees were forced to go and participate. And it didn't matter, by the way, how they voted, because voting continued for 1 week, which is unprecedented as well, even in Russian electoral history. And for every night of that week, ballots were being stored in the offices of local electoral commissions with no kind of independent oversight or control, and with ample opportunities for swapping those ballots. And the reason there was no oversight is because, of course, there were no independent observers this time. And that is a crucial difference. And it's not going to come news to anybody, to any of our listeners today, that Russian elections haven't been free or fair or democratic for a long time. But in many previous instances, it was possible to tell the difference, at least, between the officially announced tallies and the actual public sentiment. For example, the parliamentary election in 2003, which I remember very well because I was a candidate in it myself, there was a parallel vote count organized by the Communist Party using their observers and monitors at the polling stations all over the country, which showed ironically that there wasn't much of a vote theft from the communists themselves, but there was a very significant vote theft from the liberals, Yabloko and Union of Right Forces parties, both of which, as a result of that fraud, were kicked out of the Russian parliament. In 2011, of course, most prominently, we remember large-scale ballot stuffing that was uncovered and documented and publicized by independent monitors and led to unprecedented street protests, the largest under Putin's rule in the winter of 2011-2012. Now, nothing of the kind was possible this time. The only observers allowed to the polling places were those approved by public chambers, which are these kind of quasi-government bodies, state-controlled bodies in the regions and also the national one. There was no international observation, so observers from the OSCE and the Council of Europe were not invited. Instead, the Kremlin very carefully handpicked their faithful allies among the far-right politicians in European Union countries. For example, Stefan Keuter, a member of the German Bundestag for the far-right Alternative for Germany party, who is an open Nazi sympathizer, who has been caught sending out pictures of Adolf Hitler and justifying Nazi forced euthanasia policies. He was a quote-unquote international observer who was paraded, daily on Russian state television saying how great and how democratic this whole procedure is. And I can go on for a long time, but I think the whole point of this is, and I want to go back to what Lilia Shevtsova said a few minutes ago, because I think that is an absolutely central point here. She mentioned the word legitimacy, and that is the key issue. Because we know that Vladimir Putin has been illegitimate de facto for a very long time. We know that his regime hasn't been based on any kind of electoral democratic legitimacy for nearly 2 decades now, since at least 2003. The reason I mention that year is because it was the first election in post-Soviet Russia that was assessed by international observers as not fair. But up till now, even as he violated the spirit of the law, of the rule of law, Putin has been very careful to keep up the appearances and pretend to follow the letter of the law, even as he violated the spirit. I mean, as we know, he's been in power for 20 years now, but he has implemented this through tricks such as, a prearranged job swap. I don't know if anybody still remembers President Dmitry Medvedev, was officially president of the Russian Federation, believe it or not, for 4 years. But, he put in a puppet president for 4 years to keep his seat warm, and then he came back. But he followed the letter of the law. He didn't violate the term limit. Or, for example, the way he won the election, quote unquote, in 2018, when his main surviving opponent, Alexei Navalny, was artificially disqualified and barred from the ballot. But again, officially, there was still an election. Now, and that is, I think, is crucial here, and this is a central point to me in all of this exercise, is that by just simply subverting the constitutional term limit, and not even abolishing it, but waiving it personally for himself, as the effect of this constitutional amendment is, Vladimir Putin is becoming a legitimate, not just de facto, as he has been for a long time, but de jure as well. In the same league, in the same rogue league of regimes and dictatorships that had used this trick of breaking constitutional term limits before, from Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso to Alberto Fujimori in Peru to Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, who is sometimes erroneously referred to as the last dictator in Europe. From this day, and certainly from the end of his current mandate in 2024, Vladimir Putin has conscribed himself to that rogue league of dictators. And I think this is where the most important international consequence of this so-called plebiscite is. Nothing much changes for us domestically in Russia. It has been known, again, for a very long time that in a system that Putin has created, the political fate of Russia will be decided on the streets, not through the ballot box. It won't be this week or next, it won't be next month or next year, but it will certainly happen much sooner than 2036. I have absolutely no doubt of that. But the international consequence is the more important one. Because, where previous attempts by Western leaders, including by American presidents of all parties, to placate, to appease, whatever term we want to use, Vladimir Putin and his regime, were distasteful, were morally dubious, were, in my view, fundamentally wrong, now they actually become illegitimate as well, and they become akin to dealing with a usurper. And this, I think, is very important. It is very important that this position be publicly voiced and publicly made clear by the leaders of Western democracies. I was very heartened by, and before our event, I just put together some of the initial reaction that came from Western democracies to this electoral exercise. For example, very strong words here from the chairman of the US Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, Chairman Jim Risch, Republican of Idaho, who said, and I quote, "The sham vote has swept away all remnants of Putin's legitimacy," end of quote. Or another very strong bipartisan statement from the leaders of the US delegation on the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, Congressman Elsie Hastings, Democrat of Florida, and Senator Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi. They said the outcome of this vote was decided long before the ballots were tallied. State-sponsored fraud, coercion, and obfuscation make it impossible to know the true will of the Russian people, end of quote. And I have many similar examples of such statements. I think it's very important that these statements about the nature of this fraudulent plebiscite be reflected in policy and be reflected in public position of Western heads of state and government in coming days and weeks.
Okay, Volodya, thank you. And actually, I should just add, you're right that this was not a referendum as the Russian law defines referendum. I need to credit David Kramer, who sent me an email late last week pointing that out. Michael, you're never short of opinions. I give you an opportunity to respond to what Lilia and Volodya said, or if not, I have a question for you.
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. This is a real honor to be with these two folks and the Atlantic Council. I've learned so much from Lilia and Vladimir over the decades about Russia. And these days, because I am banned from traveling to Russia, all the more so that I get the chance to interact this way. So the pandemic's been good for me, Volodya, and that I get to interact with more Russians than normal as a result of Zoom. And to the Atlantic Council, I just want to say to those who don't follow their work, they have a fantastic website producing, I think, some of the best material on everything related to Russia, Ukraine, European security. I learn a tremendous amount from the work you all do. So thank you, Ambassador. And thank you, Damon. I would just say two things, one analytic and then maybe one about the policy implications that Vladimir was just talking about. First, let's all understand, why did Putin do this? The way I perceive it, and I think about other democratic transitions and transitions from democracy, something I've been studying for most of my life, when leaders have to resort to these kinds of methods, plebiscites like he just did, that is a sign of weakness, not strength. If Putin were strong, he wouldn't have to do this. Putin didn't have to do this, for instance, back in 2007, 2008, right? He had a different strategy, as Vladimir mentioned. This time around, he feels so weak that he needs to put this ability to stay in power until 2036. That's a sign of weakness, not strength. Second, I think it underscores just how little he's built in terms of an effective state. There's no political party. There's no new generation of leaders. I dare my colleagues to name me prominent, up and coming, charismatic leaders that could lead Russia after Putin. I'm sure they have names, but I'll bet you 99.99% of the rest of us have no idea who those people are. That's a sign of weakness, not strength. Third, there's an argument in the West that comes up a lot. Well, Putin's not so great for us, but the Russian people respect him and like him. And this is part of a kind of long cultural and historical history argument that's made from time to time, including in policy circles in Washington. And I would just underscore that if you were popular and strong, you wouldn't have to do this. You could do something like Lee Kuan Yew did. You could do something even like Nazarbayev did or Deng Xiaoping. Putin does not have the capability to do that. And when you dig into the opinion polls, and that's always dangerous, I think we need to caveat that all the time. Remember, this is a police state. There is no incentive. If you're sitting in Vladivostok and a complete stranger from Moscow calls you and says, "Hey, Natasha, tell me what you think of Putin." There's no incentive to tell that complete stranger the truth, right? So remember that all the time when we read these numbers. But there's something very curious about a couple of them. So support for Putin versus not, those numbers are falling. But to say on the record you don't support Putin on lines that everybody knows or listen to is a dangerous thing to do. But when you're asked the open-ended question, I find those more interesting, right? Because that means you have to proactively say that you support Putin. That number has dropped dramatically. I have it in front of me here. This is the Levada numbers. Back in 2017, 69% of Russian respondents proactively said that he is a leader that they trust. Open-ended question. Today, that number is 25%. That is a radical change. suggesting that's why he needs this plebiscite to stay in power, because he's nervous about what is going on in society. And then the last thing I would just say, this is more anecdotal, but you know, that in America these days we have a presidential election happening, and you see the enthusiasm levels for President Trump versus vice presidential candidate Biden. And Biden has an enthusiasm gap there, right? All the polls show that Trump supporters enthusiastically support him, whereas Biden supporters don't support him with as much enthusiasm. And we don't have good data on this, but anecdotally and looking through some of these numbers, it seems like Putin has a giant enthusiasm gap. Yes, people keep their head down. Nobody wants to speak out. Nobody wants to go to jail. But I don't know of a single elite, including those that support Putin, that enthusiastically get up every day and say, I can't wait for this man to be in power for 16 more years. And I think that especially is something one needs to focus on, splits among the elite, not just the population, where, you know, after 20 years, people get tired. I worked for 5 years for President Obama, experience of a lifetime, honor of a lifetime. I have no regrets. I deeply admire President Obama. Would I be enthusiastic about President Obama after 20 years in power? No. You know, it's time to move on. People get tired. And if I, as a really enthusiastic supporter of Barack Obama, would say that about him, imagine what most Russians are actually saying about Vladimir Putin and their enthusiasm for him. And then finally, on the last point, I hope we'll get to policy things, but just because Vladimir quoted some very important American politicians saying the right things, I think that's great. I would note on your list is not President Trump, because President Trump has never criticized Vladimir Putin for anything, and his silence about the plebiscite, his silence about anything related to belligerent foreign policy actions from Vladimir Putin, I think is striking.
Okay, Michael, thank you.
John, could I just in for 1 second, just to back up something Mike said about opinion polling? First of all, Mike, thank you so much for making that point. It seems to be obvious, but I'm always amazed how many times we have to explain to our Western colleagues that you shouldn't take opinion polls in an unfree, repressed society just, you know, at face value. But with all the caveats you just outlined, I want to mention one more figure. You said that 25% public confidence in Putin, which is astonishing, down from 69% 3 years ago. I'd give you one more figure, which I think could be even more telling. There was a question posed recently by the Levada a few weeks ago about age limiting the presidency in Russia at 70 years of age. And 58%, a very firm majority of Russians, said they agree with the idea that the president should be age limited at 70. Now, Vladimir Putin turns 68 this year. And I can't think of a more telling illustration of how fed up the majority of Russians are with this man.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, I'd like to follow up on the point that Michael was making, that Putin's circumstances may not be as firm as he would like it to appear. So, Lilia, COVID-19 is still raging. Oil and gas prices are very, very low. The Russian economy has taken a great hit as a result of both of those things. And of course, the Russian standard of living has taken an even greater hit. Is the Russian elite fragmenting? What does Putin's political future look like?
John, I would like, you know, with all my soul to join Vlad and Mike, you know, in their rather optimistic view of the polling results. But at the same time, you know, I agree totally with Mike. Putin is demonstrating his weakness, definitely. But on the other hand, you know, elites could be fragmented only under pressure of the tsunami from below, just like it was happening in 12-11, when the elites joined, at least representatives of the elites, joined the rallies in Moscow. If there is no wide anger, if there is no desperation from below, hardly even critics within the Russian political establishment that is critical of Putin will fragment. Well, they don't have guts for that. So the problem is there any possibility for wide and broad protests? Is there or not? According to Levada, well, we of course don't have other possibility to feel the to ground. According to Nevada, 28% of the respondents, they say that they will join the protest in case there is a possibility. Well, 2 years ago, 30% promised to join the protest, but there were no protests at all. So, well, a lot depends, firstly, on the degree of anger, secondly, on the possibility of the political elite to emerge, so on the possibility of political opposition to come together in some kind of consensus. And thirdly, what kind of idea can unite opposition? I would bet that the only idea that could unite them is not even corruption. This is the idea of rules and law and rules of law state. But here is bitter irony. Even in case of protest, even in case of fragmentation of the elite, John, there is a possibility that you'll have the regime change. And the regime change could only prolongate the life of the system. This is the bitter irony.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting analysis. Vladimir, as a active member of the opposition, what does the opposition do next in light of the plebiscite and the factors that Lilia just outlined?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember the lessons of what happened in 2011, 2012, when on September 24th, and I remember that date very well, Putin and Medvedev came out and announced their casting, as it's known, right? And also said that this had been the plan all along, which was an added insult. And basically, he'll be president, I'll be prime minister for the next 12 years, goodbye. And I remember very well that the following day, there was a very small opposition rally on Pushkinskaya Square, about 400 or 500 people. And I remember the reaction of a lot of Western journalists that this is it. This is how Russian society reacts to basically an announcement of lifetime rule, 500 people in Pushkinskaya. So everybody basically accepts it. And 3 months after that, to the day actually, on December the 24th, there were in excess of 150,000 people standing on Sakharov Avenue, just about a couple of miles down the road from the Kremlin, in what was the largest street protest, unprecedented in the time of Vladimir Putin's rule. So I just want to caution that sometimes there is this time delay and things aren't, the reaction doesn't come immediately straight away. I have no doubt that the reaction will come. Just look at what happened last summer, a year ago now, over the Moscow city elections, when several opposition candidates, popular, strong opposition candidates, were removed from elections to the Moscow City Duma. We had suddenly thousands and tens of thousands in early August, people on the streets of Moscow protesting against this. And if somebody told me at the beginning of last year that there'd be tens of thousands of people on the streets protesting over the Moscow Duma elections that nobody usually, cares much about, I probably shouldn't say this as a politician, not very politically correct, but, not many people care about local elections. But it wasn't about the elections, it was about the insult. It was about the feeling of, people having their the government wiping their feet over them, having no opinion, no voice, no right to have a say in their own future. That was the reason for the protest, not so much the Moscow elections themselves. And so, given the trends in public opinion that we heard those figures from Mike, and we see them from the Levada Center in the last few weeks, I have absolutely no doubt that there will be very strong public reaction. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is just stating the obvious, that in regimes such as the one Putin has created, it's not possible for the opposition to win elections because, well, first of all, in most cases, it's not allowed even to contest them. It's difficult to get many votes when you're not on the ballot. And secondly, these elections and these electoral exercises are fully controlled by the regime. So there's no possibility for the regime to lose them. So in systems such as this, political changes come through the streets, not through the ballot box. I'm not saying this with any kind of joy. I'd much prefer we have a normal, boring, constitutional way of changing the government as you have in the US, as people have in Western Europe. But in the system Putin has created, it's not going to be possible. So I have absolutely no doubt, to answer your question, John, about the strategy for the opposition. Well, that is the strategy. That has been the strategy for a long time now, to create a mass, peaceful, popular pressure on the regime to such an extent, as Lilia Shevtsova said a few minutes ago, that it becomes impossible for the system to withstand it. We saw this in many other post-Soviet and post-communist regimes in our part of Europe before. We saw this in In Serbia with Milosevic, we saw this in Ukraine the first time with the Orange Revolution. It was completely peaceful in 2004. We saw this in Georgia, in Armenia, in Moldova, in many, many other countries. So we don't have to invent the bicycle here. The model is absolutely obvious. The only question is, of course, when this will happen. And speaking here as a historian rather than as a politician, one thing it's very difficult to, or impossible, I should say, to predict in Russia is when that moment of change comes. Nobody predicted 1905. Nobody predicted 1917. I'm old enough to remember that nobody predicted what happened in August of 1991. And usually, by the way, it's something that, that nobody can even think of what that could be. Sometimes something very, very small that serves as a trigger. And we've seen this in other authoritarian regimes as well. So as not an analyst, but as a participant of the movement, I think the most important strategy for us in the Russian pro-democracy opposition is to start getting prepared for that future moment of change now. Because I think one of the biggest takeaways from those previous instances in 1905 and 1917, and certainly 1991, was that a lot of mistakes were made because those people who led the changes were not prepared for them, because it just fell on them in a matter of days, in a matter of 3 days, literally, in the instance of August 1991. And once things start happening around you, it's far too late to sit down and start strategizing and preparing. So I think we have to make those preparations now. And one of the most important things we can do, and this is something that organizations I've been involved with over the past few years, Open Russia and now Free Russia, that focus on as kind of the main part of our work, is to work with the young generation, the new generation of pro-democracy activists across Russia, those kinds of people we saw on the streets of Moscow last summer after the Moscow Duma elections, and previously in the anti-corruption protests called by Alexei Navalny a couple of years before that all over the country, to work with them, to help educate and prepare and train them, to give them that experience that they will need when that moment of change comes. Again, none of us knows when it will be, but I have absolutely no doubt it will come much sooner than 2036. I smiled when I saw the outline for our event today, Russia's new Tsar until 2036. I can tell you, I haven't met yet a single person, and that actually includes supporters of the regime too, who actually seriously believes that Putin will be able to stay in power until 2036. I'm not just saying this because it sounds good. I honestly have yet to meet somebody who actually believes that can happen.
That comes back to Michael's wide observation about the enthusiasm gap. Michael, over to you. Vladimir addressed, you might say, policy from the standpoint of a Russian politician. What about the policy in terms of Western policymakers? What should we be doing right now in response to the plebiscite?
Well, first, before I try to tackle that really hard question, I want to just echo something Lilia said, and with my humility. Now we're putting on different hats, right? So now I'm going to put on my professorial hat. I teach here at Stanford. That's what I've done for most of my life, and I teach courses on things like civic resistance and revolutions and democratization. And I would just say two things in humility. One, political science is really bad at predicting collapses of authoritarian rule. We have theories afterwards, but we're not very good at predicting them, to echo something Velo just said. And Lily and I have been talking about transitions from authoritarian rule going all the way back to the late 1980s, and thinking about Portugal and Spain and Latin America and how those are analogies are useful or not for the post-communist world. And I would just say we're not very good at predicting it. Second, now I'm going to put my White House hat on and my government hat on. And I've only served 5 years in the government, nothing like what you did, Ambassador, but I was struck also by how bad our intelligence community and our government is at predicting these changes. I was there for the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, the Arab Spring in 2011, the massive demonstrations in Russia in 2011, big demonstrations again in 2013 and 14 in Ukraine, and we never got any of those right. So I think we should have humility about our ability to predict the future. The second thing I want to say about elites, I think is important, something Lilia said, and I want to just use an anecdote because Vladimir already invoked it. I also remember September 24th, Volodya, 2011. I was working at the White House. I went in to brief the president a couple days later about that event. And I remember that day, I don't know if you remember, but a gentleman by the name of Arkady Dvorkovich, who worked for President Medvedev at the time, tweeted out. He used to be very active on Twitter. And now he just tweets about chess. But back then he was more active, and he said, now it's just time for us to all go watch football. And that was really striking to me. Here's a very senior figure in the Medvedev government basically saying, all bets are off, Putin's coming to power, and we're going to be marginalized. But we know what happened to Dvorkovich later, right? We know that he didn't defect. He didn't join the demonstrations. He didn't join with Kara-Murza. He became deputy prime minister. He was co-opted back into the system. And I use that anecdote just to underscore something that Lilia says about elites. Just because you have negative preferences about Putin doesn't mean that you're brave enough or willing enough to act upon them. And many people don't know this, but the first book I wrote, my dissertation, was about political change in Southern Africa. And I wrote about two gentlemen, Dos Santos in Angola and Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Both of those political leaders were extremely unpopular, and yet they stayed in power for decades. So I just say that as a way to, I don't know who's right and wrong. I'm very far a part of it, but just understand we're bad at those predictions. And that leads me then to answer your question, John. I think we cannot pretend that we know the answer to when the political opposition will have their opportunities to do what Vladimir was describing. But I do think it's incumbent upon the West, and I use that term, or the democratic world together, that's even a better term, to not do anything that empowers the autocratic regime in Russia today. I remember this very vividly from a colleague of mine who was fighting against Mubarak before 2011. He said, "We don't want your help, Mike." This was a democratic activist. We don't want your money and all that. We just want you to stop helping our opponent. And I think that's really smart wisdom for how to deal with Putin's Russia today. That is, go back to Kennan maybe, and that's a useful way to think about it. There are others who have written about it, but I think the West has to stop helping Putin. We have to stop thinking we're going to have another ability to interact with him, with the new president. I think all those days are over, and I think a big dose of containment is most important, a small dose of engagement when it's international interests, and a great deal of engagement with Russian society to the best of our abilities, so that we make it clear both in their society, but also in our society, that our problem is not with Russians, and our problem is not even with Russia. Our problem is with Vladimir Putin.
Okay, that's concise, to the point. All right, we have lots of questions, and I'll start with one from Jill Doherty, who says maybe the plebiscite is about not because Putin wants to stay in power till 2036, but as a way to fix his status going into the immediate future, and so he can then follow options. Any comments on this as a possibility?
Jill, if I may, John, well, everything is possible, but I have hidden idea that perhaps Putin is not thinking with 100% assurance that he will stay beyond 2024, because in those constitutional amendments that he forced Russia to endorse, there are a lot of so-called hidden bottoms. State council possibility to join the Federation Council as a chairman, so he can join, the existing institution, grind it into dust, and then control a weak president, because in fact he prepares the system for strong presidency, but at the same time it's a kind of cognitive dissonance. He prepares possibility to stay as the godfather, as the Deng Xiaoping, even in another role. So while apparently he's still thinking, he's looking around, he's looking at the West, and he's thinking at Belarus, how Lukashenko will cope, with a system that is absolutely not effective, and how Lukashenko will cope with his own, self-transfer of power.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this?
Just one quick comment on what Lilia just said. One to support the possibility of the version that she just outlined. One of these new 206 constitutional amendments, and not many people actually notice that, codifies lifetime immunity from prosecution for all former presidents, as well as a lifetime senator rule, as Lilia just outlined. But I think what you said, John, is important too. Somebody who's a strongman in a dictatorial system cannot afford to look like a lame duck, which he's increasingly becoming, he's increasingly beginning to do. But again, I just think because of the trends in public sentiments, because of, frankly speaking, his age, that is becoming unavoidable, even with all these constitutional shenanigans that they just brought about.
Okay, another question relating to Russia's political future comes from Dan Fried. He notes how back in the day of the Cold War, people were saying, well, Brezhnev is not the worst that Russia could produce. He also notes that some, you might say, people who are more kindly disposed towards Kremlin policy in the West say Putin is not the worst that Russia could produce. Thoughts on this?
Then it's a possibility. We have to live and to see. And by the way, there is a huge difference between Brezhnev and Putin. Brezhnev, the head of the gerontocracy, the old guys who are not ready to fight for their future and for their survival. And at the moment, we have the ruling group of Praetorians who will be fighting for their future and for their survival. That's a difference for us, for Russia.
Although they're getting close in age to Brezhnev's Politburo, I have to add. But I know Dan Fried very well, and I know that he asked this question with a provocative reason in mind, because Dan Fried is one of those policymakers in the United States who never belonged to this group of cultural determinists Mike McFaul referred to a few minutes ago, who subscribe to this view that, those Russians, they just can't do better. They are destined to live under these autocracies. They like the strong hand. This is the best they can do. To me as a Russian, this has always sounded extremely insulting. And to me as a historian, this also sounds completely wrong, because actually, if you look at the history of Russia over the past century or so, you will see that every time the Russian people actually had an opportunity to freely choose between a democratic and an authoritarian way, they always chose the democratic way. Now, granted, it wasn't too many times in our history that we did get this free choice, but every time we did, the first Duma election in 1906, the Constituent Assembly election in 1917, the presidential election in 1991, it was always the democratic forces over the authoritarian forces. So that view, apart from being insulting and offensive, is also actually not grounded in reality. And I'm glad Dan asked this question to kind of provoke this conversation, because yes, of course, Russia can do much, much better than a corrupt, crooked former KGB agent. And it's, again, both insulting and wrong to suggest otherwise. And, a country with 140 million people, a country with great centuries-old European culture, it's offensive to suggest that, we can't find anybody better than this. And Dan, if you're listening to this, I thank you for raising this point.
Okay. John, could I add one thing to that? So I know this argument well. The fascists are going to take over if he's bad, but he's not as bad as the fascists. That argument. By the way, I heard this argument many, many times when I was ambassador to Russia from people that worked for Vladimir Putin to remind me, Mike, the communists are coming. If remember, Putin's a transitional figure. You got to give him a break. It was an argument I heard from very senior people in the government. And I would just say two things about that. One is the political orientation of people that are opposed to Putin are changing. And they're not just liberals versus the state. I mean, there's a lot of social democratic minded folks. There's a lot of people in opposition to Putin today that look like other social movements, including in my country. So this old thing about, you got to be a liberal and support liberal reform and macroeconomic policy and good central banking. You guys got to support us. You in the West have to support us. I think we need to challenge that assumption. But the more important point is this one. I actually think Vladimir Putin's pretty bad. Compared to Brezhnev, think about what he's done in terms of U.S. national interests. Annexation. We didn't have annexation during the Cold War. Annexation is back after 2014. Meddling, intervention, violating our sovereignty in 2016 in the presidential election here in our country. I don't remember Brezhnev doing that. That was horrible and might happen again. 2017, a coup in 2018, Mr. Putin tried to kill Mr. Skripal in a NATO country. I was actually part of the team that helped to release Mr. Skripal back in 2010. We did a spy swap. And it was always understood during the Cold War that once you did that, you leave those people alone. Putin has a different strategy about that. He went after and tried to kill Mr. Skripal. And he maybe has killed other people around the world, including in Berlin, including in Austria. And now this latest revelation that he may have paid bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, those seem to me like a pretty belligerent, anti-liberal, anti-American leader in Russia today. So it's hard for me to imagine, tell me who could be worse for that in terms of our interests.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We have a question from three people, Angela Stent, President Ilves, and Valeria Yegisman of Voice of America, regarding Russia's foreign policy. Is Putin now, post-plebiscite, post-consolidation of Crimea, ready for a new adventure? Should we be concerned about this?
Should I start, John? It's a great question, and apparently Angela could have given an answer herself. Well, I would say that at the moment, the Kremlin definitely tries to normalize the relationship with the West. Despite of this hostility inside, despite of creating an image of encircled Russia fortress, Putin definitely during the last year even more is trying to bridge the gap between Russia and Europe, and even organize the dialogue with the United States. Why? For different reasons, not only because of sanctions. It seems to me the Kremlin believes that at least American sanctions are eternity, but there is, the start that the Kremlin wants to extend. And secondly, Russia cannot be a great power and cannot be a member of the global concert, being in isolation and being in total confrontation with America and Europe. In order to be a great power, Putin wants Russia to return back. And hence, this idea of his during the last couple of months that he permanently introduces, let's do a new concept on the basis of the permanent members of the Security Council. Here, apparently, some kind of fatal mistake has been done because he forgot about Germany. Germany is not a permanent member of the Security Council. So how the global concept of great powers could be convened without Germany? This is the first question mark. And secondly, he apparently believes, looking at the outside world, that the West is in confusion, that the West has lost its trajectory, and this is high time, firstly, to finish his own, domestic political project, and secondly, to offer his idea of the liberal order before the West solves all his problems. And there is another apparently problem, at least I, being in Kremlin, would be having this kind of, challenge in my mind. What to do when he sees the new bipolarity emerging, America versus China? What will be the role of Russia in this kind of strange situation when tango is only for two? There is no third partner for the tango. That's why, the pro-Kremlin experts are, playing with ideas of equidistance, of new balance, etc., etc. And especially in the situation when when President Macron and some other people in Europe are thinking about re-engagement. This is a kind of already invitation for Putin to join the avant-scene.
Okay, thank you. Vlad or Michael, you want to comment on this?
Well, I think generally speaking, and this has been clear from, again, a century more of Russian history, in our country, domestic repression and external aggression always go hand in hand. They're always two sides of the same coin. And it's logical if you think about it. Why would you expect a regime that tramples on the rights of its own citizens and violates its own laws and its own constitution to then respect the interests, of other countries or abide by international law? And it was very unfortunate that for many initial years of Vladimir Putin's rule, the leaders of Western democracies, and this includes US presidents of both political parties, basically turned a blind eye on domestic repression in Russia, preferring to find a way to deal with Putin nevertheless, and one day woke up to the first state-to-state territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which is what Vladimir Putin did with Crimea in 2014. So those two things are directly linked, and they will continue to be linked as long as this regime remains in power. The other linkage is true as well, by the way, on the good side. When Russia is democratic domestically, it has a very different foreign policy. I'm glad President Ilves was one of the people who asked this question, because, every time I'm in Tallinn, I like to go to that place on Luna Street, just outside the old town, where there's a plaque, a memorial plaque to Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, honoring his role in helping the Baltic states to regain their freedom in the early 1990s. And I always just like standing by that plaque and watching the reaction of Western tourists and seeing amazement on many of their faces. How is it possible that a Russian president helped regain freedom for Soviet captive states? But it is possible, and President Yeltsin played an instrumental role, as we all remember that period in the early 1990s. Because again, when Russia has a government that's democratic minded domestically and that respects or tries to respect the rule of law at home, it will also project those values in international relations. So I'm afraid I don't have a very good or satisfying answer to this, because while Vladimir Putin's regime remains in the Kremlin, both domestic repression and, yes, a very significant chance of external aggressiveness will continue to be dominating factors of Russian domestic and foreign policy. And again, it works the other way too. Once Russia has a government that respects the rights and freedoms of its own people, it will also be much more responsible as an actor on the international stage. And so when that day finally comes, when Russia has a democratically elected government, that will, of course, first and foremost be in our interest, in the interests of the citizens of the Russian Federation. But I think it will also be a good day for the whole of the rule-abiding international community.
I agree with that analysis. Michael, I've got a fact question for you from Robert Gill. Would a Biden victory hasten the end of Putinism indirectly?
I'm so gun shy of making predictions about futures of regimes, but I do think I will use that question as an opportunity to underscore something that I don't think gets enough attention in the West and in the liberal world, and that is the ideological dimension of Putin and Putinism in engaging with the West. So there are two different things going on. So number one is what Lilia kind of described. Leaders in the West are impatient. They want to get back to normal, re-engagement. Macron's, talking about that is a very symptomatic of that. And, it's like, well, let's just forget about what happened in the past and get on with, engaging Russia. And so that's one dynamic that I think is very dangerous. And one should not reward Putin for being stubborn and not doing anything different, right? I think that's a real danger with respect to sanctions, for instance, that needs to be fought. But there's another piece going on that I think deserves a lot more attention. Putin is not just engaging with the West. Putin is engaging with illiberals in the West. He's a populist, nationalist, orthodox. He believes in sovereignty as opposed to liberal institutions. And he is forging alliances with people in the West. So this is not a fight between Russia and the West. This is a fight between liberals and illiberals. And this fight happens within countries, not just between countries. And when I look at Europe, I ask my colleagues, Lilia and Volodya know better, is Viktor Orban closer to Putin ideologically or Joe Biden? Is Matteo Salvini closer to Putin or Joe Biden? And is Donald Trump, President Trump, closer to Salvini, Orban, and Putin than Joe Biden or Angela Merkel? And when you begin to answer those questions and you begin to see what Russia does in many different dimensions to create what I call this alliance of the illiberal international, I think we have to stop thinking that the West is united ideologically and how we think about Putin. And in my own country, I don't know those other countries as well, but public opinion shows that Putin's popularity among the Republican Party has surged in the last 4 years. And ideologically, there are things that some Americans are in greater solidarity with Putin and his ideas than the kind of liberal democratic ideas that we sometimes take for granted in these conversations.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got a question, a very interesting question from Paul Carter. To stop any street revolt, Putin will need to rely on the new Rosgvardia. Is there any data on attitude inside Rosgvardia about an indoctrination program to maintain an ideological discipline? And what might happen if they are called upon to fire on other Russians, if there are major protests? Lilia or Vlad, would you want to try that question? It's provocative, but very interesting.
Well, it depends. It depends on the degree of protest. I remember years ago when I was still working, well, together with Mike at Carnegie. There was a mass protest in Moscow. And in the building where Moscow Carnegie Center is situated, we had quite a few people from Spetsnaz, from the riot police, together with a colonel. Well, it was before Rosguardia National Guard was formed. And the poor guys were standing and sitting there, and we decided to give them some coffee. So we brought coffee, and I talked to a very nice guy who was colonel. And I asked him, what are you going to do? He said, it depends how many people are on the street. If there are 500 or 1,000, we'll whack them down. I said, if there are 10,000, he said, we'll think about. I said, even if there are 500,000, he said, we'll join them.
Absolutely. And I think we've actually seen the answer to that question in our history before, and that was in August of 1991, when there was an order given to storm the White House, to arrest Boris Yeltsin, to disperse all the peaceful protesters. But there were so many people, there was actually 500,000 people standing in front of the White House in August of 1991, and the army refused to implement that order. I think that we know the answer to this. This is why I think it's far more important to focus on the Kadyrovites, on the Chechen regiments that are loyal to the Kremlin, the people that the Kremlin used to murder Boris Nemtsov, for example, because, you know, Russian military, Russian police would not, I'm absolutely convinced about this, would not shoot at unarmed Russian demonstrators on the streets of Moscow. Those guys, the Kadyrov Guard, they're ready to do anything. And we know, actually, even from our own experience back in 2011, 2012, that big winter of protests, we know that when there were mass opposition rallies planned, there were fighters from these Kadyrov regiments brought into Moscow and stationed around hotels, including the President Hotel in Bolshaya Yakimanka. This is where the commanders were stationed in the event that something like this would need to be done. So I think this is the most kind of worrying aspect to watch. And very briefly, because I know our time is almost out, I wanted to back up what Mike McFaul said a few minutes ago. I think the most important response from Western democracies would be to deny Vladimir Putin's regime the prestige and the legitimacy that he so desperately craves. Otherwise, he would not have gone through the sham of a plebiscite. But I think it is very important to recognize that substantive difference, that even though Putin has been illegitimate de facto for a long time, he has, as of July 1st, or again, at least until from the end of his current mandate, he becomes illegitimate de jure as well. No more invitations to the G8, no more red carpet treatment, no more high-level state visits. It's very important that those strong statements, some of which I quoted a few minutes ago, are actually reflected in policy.
Right, that's the last word. I'd like to thank Lilia, Michael, and Vlad for participating today, and for everyone for tuning in. And this is by no means the last event we're going to be doing on Russia's future. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John. Thank you for hosting.
Bye-bye. Всего хорошего. До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.